Hello and welcome to the third review of Request Month 2023. This is Prodeus for PC, Mac, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, and Nintendo Switch. What you'll be seeing throughout this video is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by Bounding Box Software and published by Humble Games that was first released into early access in 2020, with its full 1.0 release following in September of last year. Now, I've been keeping my eye on this game for quite a long time, and the early buzz surrounding it was very positive. It was shaping up to be a very nice retro throwback first-person shooter with a rather interesting, kind of chunky art style. So how did it turn out? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation. This runs on the Unity engine, and it is designed with a retro throwback aesthetic. This means that all of the textures are designed to be kind of pixelated and low res, making it seem like something that could have come out in the late 90s or so. And they've managed to achieve that aesthetic quite well, but also have implemented some more modern techniques, namely things like particle effects and lighting, to try to set it apart from games that actually were released back then and other retro shooters. For the most part, they've managed to achieve this aesthetic quite well, and if you want to go even further into the retro side of things, there is an option to switch the graphics for the enemies and the items over into 2D sprites as opposed to 3D models, but I chose not to mess around with that. It's a completely optional thing that's really just up to personal preference, and I decided to go with 3D models, and frankly, the game looks quite good with those. Aside from the retro throwback visuals, they also put a fair bit of effort into their gore system. When you go around and start blasting enemies, the blood and guts will just start slathering the environment around you, and enemies will explode into meaty chunks in a rather glorious fashion. Needless to say, that is a very positive thing for the gunplay, which I'll be talking about when I get to the gameplay. But aside from the gore system and the visual stylings, there's actually not a whole lot to talk about when it comes to visuals in Prodeus. It just looks solid all around, but never really goes into truly impressive territory. And the only thing that's really worth complaining about is that sometimes the amount of particle effects and gore effects on screen can make it a bit difficult to see what you're doing. But unlike with the game I reviewed previously this month, Black, where it was constantly getting in your way, that kind of thing only gets in the way in Prodeus some of the time, and usually it doesn't last more than a second or two, so it's really more of a mild annoyance than anything else, and actually doesn't affect the game all that much. But once we've moved on from the visuals, there's the sound design. Now, there's not really any voice acting to speak of, just a bunch of grunting and yelling from the player character. So it's really all down to the sound effects and the music. And the way I would describe the sound effects is chunky. Everything has a definite weight to it, and from the sounds of gunfire to the explosions and the meaty chunks splattering all over the place, everything sounds pretty satisfying. They certainly could have had punchier shotgun and explosion sounds in particular, but they're not really anything worth complaining about. They've done a pretty solid job all around with the sound here. Then of course there's the soundtrack by Andrew Hulshult and James Paddock, which is a bunch of very heavy industrial kind of stuff that works perfectly fine for the sci-fi and retro throwback shooter aesthetics that they're going for here. Unfortunately, it all tends to bleed together a fair bit, and thus you don't really have any particular track in the soundtrack that really stands out, but it all works perfectly fine when you're actually playing the game, and they do have a dynamic soundtrack, so when the action heats up, you get the heavier industrial stuff, whereas when you're just wandering around the level and not actually in combat, you get a bit more of the ambient stuff. And when you bring all that presentation together, you end up with something that just works. There's just not much to complain about as far as the visuals and sound are concerned, so, well, let's just move on to what really matter here, which are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is, it's a retro throwback shooter, we don't need no fucking story. You probably think I'm joking, but I'm really not. This game basically doesn't have a story. It's almost exclusively gameplay from one level to the next, with maybe a note here or there that explains something about the level you're in, but not really anything more than that. I'm sure if you really went out of your way to try to piece together a story for this thing, you could, but for the average player who's just going to be playing through the game normally, it might as well not even have a story, which means that it's reliant almost exclusively on its gameplay to hold everything up. So how is the gameplay? Well, it is a retro throwback first-person shooter, which means that you have a fairly fast movement speed. You have a pretty wide arsenal available to you, which has a lot of the standards for the genre, stuff like pistol, shotgun, chain gun, things like that. But even though most of the weapons have fairly standard archetypes, they do try to make them a bit different by giving them secondary fires as well as some additional quirks. Things like the super shotgun not being a double-barreled shotgun, but rather a quad-barreled shotgun. Or the pistol's primary fire being semi-automatic, whereas the secondary fire is a 3-round burst. Or when things get a bit more interesting, the plasma rifle being the standard thing that we expect from a plasma gun from the likes of, say, Doom, with the primary fire, just a rapid-fire shot, but the secondary fire allows you to send a tracking shot that will then steer subsequent normal plasma shots to that point, so you can latch onto an enemy and then shoot them from around corners. But some of the secondary fire options are very different from the primary fire. For example, the arc rail, which is frankly my favorite weapon in the entire game, being a lightning gun that attacks not only the enemy you're shooting directly, but also nearby enemies as the lightning arcs out to them with the primary fire. But when you use the secondary fire, it goes into a zoomed in or scoped mode that condenses all of that lightning into one very powerful beam, basically turning it into a railgun. This kind of thing makes what would otherwise be a mostly fairly standard retro throwback arsenal actually quite interesting to mess around with, and all of the weapons feel chunky and powerful. But while all of the weapons are satisfying to use and they never become useless, you will be able to use them from the beginning of the game on up through the very end of it. Some of the weapons do feel a bit superfluous, like they were just included in the game to have an extra weapon of a particular type, rather than actually having their own specific use like you would see in, say, a classic retro shooter like Quake. I mean, some examples include things like you have a pump-action shotgun, and then a super shotgun, and also an auto shotgun, which is just a semi-automatic shotgun. And its secondary fire is just a ricocheting shot, so it doesn't really occupy any role that isn't already occupied by the pump-action or the super shotgun. Thus, it becomes a bit of a matter of personal preference. Then, of course, there are the bullet weapons, the pistol, the shredders, and then the minigun. The shredders occupy this weird middle ground between the pistol, which, as far as I can tell, actually has a slightly higher damage output than the shredders because it has more powerful individual shots, and you can get more accuracy out of it. But the shredders have more accuracy than the minigun at the cost of having a magazine capacity, meaning you need to reload them, whereas with the minigun, you don't. Again, it's not necessarily that any of these weapons feel underpowered or useless or anything like that, because they're all still satisfying to use. It's just the design of some of these weapons just feels like they threw them in there to have an extra weapon here or there, rather than actually designing the entire experience around a tight selection of weapons, each of which has its own specific role. And I think a lot of that comes down to how they designed actually acquiring some of these weapons, because some of them you do just pick up as you're wandering around in the various levels, but a lot of them need to be acquired through the shop using ore that you find scattered around the levels in secret areas. On the one hand, that gives you a bit of an incentive to actually explore the levels and find all the secret areas and all of the ore, but on the other hand, it limits the way they had to design the levels, because the idea is that they need to be completable without having to spend anything in the shop, because the ore is hidden out of the way. It's in secret areas, so you have to go out of your way to find it. As such, anything that has to be acquired in the shop is really just a bonus item, and that includes things like the double jump, so even advanced movement techniques are locked away in the shop, and thus every single level has to be completable using only the basic movement, which is just running around on the ground, and the basic jump. That's fine, except that it means that things like the double jump and the dash are kind of superfluous to the game as well. They're really only used for secret hunting or if you just feel like using them in the midst of combat. And that's a bit of a shame because the level design as is, with those restrictions, is actually pretty strong. They've got numerous secrets to find, they've got actually some interesting gimmicks on some of the levels, and for the most part the levels flow quite well. There are a few issues here and there with areas where they lock you in and then spawn in a bunch of enemies for you to fight, only opening the area once you've beaten all of them. but at worst that really just becomes a bit tedious, nothing all that serious. So it's a shame that the level designers didn't really get to stretch their legs as much as you might hope, with there being things like a double jump and a dash in the game, and giving you advanced movement techniques that could have been used to create some fairly interesting areas. Although then the temptation would be to do what Doom Eternal did and have too much platforming in the game, so it's a bit hard to say whether giving the player the advanced movement as opposed to having them go and find a bunch of secret areas to unlock it, basically just to unlock additional secret areas, would have gone. We could speculate all day as to whether or not it would have been a good thing. The fact of the matter is, though, that they included mechanics but then don't really take full advantage of them. And that's really the problem with Prodeus more than anything else, because if you take it in its individual components, then it stacks up as a very strong first-person shooter, specifically a retro throwback one, because it's got very nice meaty gunplay where all the weapons feel great to use, the effect on target is fantastic, and the absolute madness that can go on in the middle of combat is just glorious. It's got good level design that is easy to navigate without getting lost, and they've got some neat gimmicks on several of the levels that make them interesting. And if the included campaign, which is somewhere around 5 or 6 hours long depending on your difficulty setting and how thorough you are with secret hunting and such, isn't enough for you, then there's always community content, because they include a rather robust level editor, allowing the community to make their own levels that anybody can just download and play. This is all very good stuff. It's just that there's not really a story to speak of. Not that big of a deal in a retro first-person shooter or a retro throwback shooter, but still worth mentioning. And the unlock system makes it so the game really never reaches its full potential. It does also have a multiplayer mode where you have deathmatch, team deathmatch, that kind of thing, as well as up to 4-player co-op in the campaign, but you have to create an additional account for that, and honestly, I really didn't bother with it because of that. I'm just tired of creating accounts for damn near everything these days, especially considering that the Prodeus multiplayer community is very small, and I'm always on at weird times, so I never really have much of an opportunity to get into a multiplayer game anyway. That said, Prodeus is still primarily a single-player experience, and what is on offer here is very solid. It is a good first-person shooter that is fun to play. But it could have been so much better, and that wasted potential is ultimately what frustrates me so much about the game. I was going through the entire thing and I was like, this is fun, but why am I not really enjoying this as much as I think I should? And then the further I got into the game, the more I understood that it really is just a case of wasted potential. I could see right in front of me where the game could have been truly wonderful, and instead, it's just good. It's still a game that's well worth playing, don't get me wrong, especially if you're a fan of retro throwback first-person shooters. Is it going to convert you if you're not already a fan of them, though? Probably not. As such, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. If you're a fan of retro throwback shooters and you don't already have a copy of Prodeus, go ahead and pick it up. You will probably enjoy it quite a lot. But as for those of you who might be a bit more on the fence about it, maybe just wait until it goes on sale. Thank you all very much for watching, and thanks for bearing with me during the delays on this one. I was hoping to get this out on Saturday, but sometimes things don't go according to plan, and this past week has just been an absolute mess. Hopefully this coming week will be considerably less of a mess, so we'll just have to wait and see on that. At any rate, there's only one more review left for the Request Month content, and for those of you who might still have some questions for the Q&A video, there's still a few days to get the submissions in for that, so go ahead and get those Q&A submissions in, and then we'll have that video go up in the early parts of April, so stay tuned for that. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.